ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kara, and I'm with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Today's research results webinar is Strategic Mowing and Nutrients in Roadway Stormwater, and we are excited to have Andrew Turpick and Crystal Daniels as our presenters today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items to ensure a smooth webinar experience for everyone. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the questions panel on your screen. You can type your questions there and we will address them during the dedicated Q&A session at the end. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties or have any other issues, feel free to use the chat panel to communicate with our team and we'll do our best to assist you. This session is being recorded. To ensure accessibility, we will edit the closed captions and will email the link to all registrants within the next week. All right, with that out of the way, let's get started. It's my pleasure to hand it over to Andrew. Andrew, the virtual floor is yours.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm Andrew Turpak. I'm a research assistant professor at Ohio State University. I work in the Department of Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Daniels, principal consultant with Davie Resource Group, and share some of the results from some research that we've been working on with ODOT for the last 2.5 years, give or take, looking at how mowing impacts nutrients in roadway stormwater. So let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. All right, so first I want to acknowledge the members of the research team. So Ohio State University was the principal investigator on this proposal. We were led by Dr. Ryan Winston, an associate professor here in the department, myself, as well as graduate student Ben Phillips, who recently just finished his master's program. And our primary tasks on the project were sort of all focused around the stormwater monitoring aspects of the project, as well as a lot of the data analysis and recommendations development kind of at the conclusion here. Next, we were joined with Davie Resource Group as a co-principal investigator. So their team was led by Cheryl Daniels and comprised of Keith Shane and Angela Burdell. And really, Davie brought the sort of the vegetation and soils expertise to the team. So they worked a lot with the vegetation health surveys that we'll be talking about here, and also sort of analyzing those results, as well as some results from aerial surveys that we had performed to develop recommendations resulting from the research. We also had Mark McCabe on the team when he was with JEO Consulting Group as a co-PI, and really helped us early on with some of the strategic mowing treatments that we designed and sort of laying out the experiment at its onset. And last but certainly not least, we want to recognize and thank the members of the Technical Advisory Committee with ODOT. So that was John Pryor, Becky Humphreys, Joel Hunt, and James Cook. And we certainly appreciate their willingness to partner with us on the project and all of their sort of insights and help that they provided along the way. And we certainly hope that the final outcomes of this project are something that ODOT finds useful and other entities find useful down the road. So I quickly want to just go through a brief presentation to outline. We'll start by talking about the research background and the objectives that we laid out at the onset of the research, and then the timeline that we worked with. We'll talk a little bit about the research approach. It is relatively unique in that we sort of worked in these highway interchanges and had a lot of different treatments of different mowing practices in a relatively small geographic space. We'll talk briefly about sampling and data before we get into the meat of the presentation, which will be about the results of field monitoring. So ranging from all things sort of stormwater related to hydrology and water quality. And we'll also talk about the results of these different mowing treatments on the vegetation and soil health. We'll conclude with recommendations for implementation for these different mowing practices, and then hopefully have plenty of time at the end for questions from the audience. So
Andrew?
As a bit of background, ODOT maintains over...
Sorry. Andrew, sorry to interrupt you. Could you please go ahead and click down at the bottom of your screen? It says the go-to app. There? Yes, thank you.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, sorry about that. So getting back into the background of the research, ODOT maintains over 50,000 lane miles of pavement across the state. And one of the critical components to the safety of motorists on those lane miles of pavement is various roadside drainage infrastructure. So we've got a couple of different photos there from some of our research sites, whether that's a reinforced concrete pipe, a culvert, or an open ditch, as you can see there on the right. This is all essential to safe road design, and the maintenance of these structures is critical to maintain the passability of roads and motorist safety. And as part of that, they do their job of conveying stormwater runoff really well. We're not providing a lot of restriction to flows. Oftentimes, we're sort of getting the flows away from the roads and downstream, relatively speaking, as quickly as possible. And so in the conveyance of that stormwater, they're also conveying the things that stormwater carries with it, namely, as a primary focus of this project, nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus species, which can sort of have these downstream negative impacts. Working in Ohio, one of the things that we're particularly aware of related to nutrients and stormwater is recurrent harmful algal blooms, or HABs. These are prevalent across a number of different surface water bodies across the state, but perhaps none as important as the Western Lake Erie Basin. You can see a picture there from a NASA satellite in 2024, how that sort of algal bloom is starting to spread along the Lake Erie coastline there. And this is primarily important because of just how unique a water resource Lake Erie is. So it's a huge economic and environmental asset for the state. It props up the economies of many of these nearshore communities, as well as has these very large and regionally significant environmental benefits and ecosystem services that the lake provides. So when we have these harmful algal blooms, we're sort of posing risks to all of the above. It can have impacts in the $6+ figure amounts in terms of the economic impacts. As of the last couple of years, there have been changes in different TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, in the different watersheds which drain to Lake Erie. Perhaps most importantly for this project is changes to the Maumee watershed nutrient TMDL and different changes to the waste load allocations for land managers in that watershed. And this was really the impetus for this project, was sort of we saw what was coming down the pike in terms of regulations to manage nutrients in the watershed, and ODOT, of course, being a land manager of a number of different assets in the Maumee, thinking about ways that we can sort of change and mitigate nutrient exports and hopefully minimize contributions to these HABs and comply with Ohio EPA regulations. So of all of the different sort of maintenance activities ODOT is required to do on these 50,000 lane miles of pavement, perhaps none is most important as right-of-way management, i.e. mowing. So many of these lane miles of pavement are abutted by grassed right-of-way, whether that's a median strip on a divided highway or pervious areas on the shoulders of a highway. This right-of-way management is required to maintain the safety of the road conditions for passing motorists. So whether that's maintaining things like line of sight, visibility, or dissuading certain plant species from growing to sort of kind of maintain safe road conditions. And the idea here was that, if we're performing this right-of-way mowing across the Maumee on ODOT managed roads, the thought was that these operations have the potential to introduce opportunities for nutrients to leach from the grass clippings. So when we go in there and we're cutting down a huge amount of area, when you kind of add all these up in total, is that a potential source of nutrients that then get picked up by stormwater and conveyed downstream in the Maumee and eventually into Lake Erie? So really the driving hypothesis for this research was, is there any sort of strategic planning that can be done to better sort of organize and schedule the mowing of these rights of ways to reduce nutrient conveyance from ODOT roads and therefore ODOT's contributions to harmful algal blooms in the Western Lake Erie Basin? So the goals and objectives for the project, first and foremost, was just to determine what was out there. So what is the typical pollutant load, i.e. mass of nutrients that's being conveyed in stormwater from ODOT rights of way? specifically vegetated rights of way. And we were looking again at these interchange areas that I'll talk about here in a second. And the second objective was to understand whether strategically timing and modifying the schedule of these mowing efforts can help meet Ohio EPA permit obligations, and again, lessen the contributions to HABs from ODOT managed rights of ways. So the project happened a little over 2.5 years ago is when we started the project in September 2023. And we first started out as a research team with a 7-month planning phase. So here we were doing a pretty thorough literature review of peer-reviewed studies of road runoff and road runoff water quality. We were also looking at ODOT's current mowing practices and making sure that we understood sort of the ins and outs of the current SOP as it comes to right-of-way mowing in Ohio. Cheryl and her team led interviews with other state departments of transportation to understand their sort of typical mowing practices, what sort of environmental factors they consider with mowing, and whether they have any strategic sort of impetus behind their mowing schedule when it comes to maybe a similar sort of environmental challenge like HABs in Ohio. And then finally, we concluded the first phase with designing the strategic mowing treatments and sort of the experiment as a whole, and selecting sites for which to implement these different treatments in phase 2. So phase 2 happened over the last 2 years. Beginning in April 2024, we started out with quite a bit of monitoring equipment installation. I'll show some photos of that in the coming slides here. And we performed this stormwater monitoring over the course of 2 seasons. So roughly between April and November of 2024, and roughly the same time period in 2025. During those 2 years, we also assessed the health of vegetation and soils and the composition of vegetation in the interchanges. And then we sort of lumped all of our results together into analysis of pollutant loads and different estimates of pollutant loading rates, and ultimately developed recommendations for ODOT and other interested parties for how they might be able to implement these strategic mowing treatments as a best management practice for right-of-way management. So briefly, I'm going to review how ODOT currently mows their rights-of-ways and manages vegetation along their roads. It's divided up into several different zones. So starting with zone 1, the closest to the pavement, I should say. You can kind of think of this as the shoulder. It's kept free from vegetation, which is really critical for line of sight and motorist safety. As you can imagine, we don't want a lot of vegetation growing on the shoulder. We want that to serve as an area for motorists to clearly see the edge of the pavement and utilize as needed when you have things like a breakdown, construction, etc. The second zone is zone 2, also called the recovery zone. That's essentially the first 30 feet from the edge of the pavement. And this gets mowed quite frequently relative to other zones. And it's sort of mowed at a different frequency depending on the time of the year and what sort of area the road in question is in. And these zones are predominated by cool season grasses. Next is zone 3, the transition zone. That's sort of the zone that we worked in for the research that we're going to be talking about today. It's mowed less often than zone 2, and it's pretty typical to see native grasses and wildflowers predominate these areas. And again, as I mentioned, it's sort of selectively managed, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then finally, the furthest zone from the pavement is referred to as the undisturbed zone. Again, it's pretty common there to see native grasses and wildflowers, and then other larger vegetation sort of gets managed with the needs of adjacent land managers and that sort of thing. But again, we'll focus today primarily on this sort of zone 3 area. As I mentioned, these different zones are managed throughout the year in different ways, sort of depending on where you're at. Here in this photo, you can see that zone 2, the first 30 feet from the edge of the pavement, that's just been recently mowed in this photo. And in spring and summertime, that's mowed between 2 and 4 times in a particular growing season. The frequency at which these areas are mowed is really dictated by whether the area is in a rural area versus an urban area. In urban areas, I think that the number is closer to 4 times per year. The remaining zones, zone 3 in particular, are sort of mowed. The entire backslope is sort of mowed once annually, depending on the location. So ODOT uses sort of I-70 as a rough way to divide the state into 2 zones. North of I-70, the entire right-of-way is mowed sometime between October and April. And then south of I-70, the entire right-of-way is mowed sometime between October and March. And one of the goals there is really to minimize the spread of invasives, but also protect pollinators like the monarch butterfly. So Will mentioned that ODOT's current mowing practices and current SOP related to right-of-way management already has several environmental sort of concerns that are addressed into the way that it's scheduled. Some other goals, as I mentioned, are to maintain line of sight, minimize the spread of invasives, and then prevent grass and forest fires as needed. So next I'll talk a little bit about the different strategic mowing treatments that we designed for this research. Here you can see one of the interchanges that we studied. I'll show another map of that in a minute. But we're kind of working within these different infield areas of this particular interchange, which is at the intersection of I-75 and State Route 25 in Signet, Ohio. Working sort of clockwise from the top left there, our first treatment, which we called treatment 1, was sort of to move the mowing window as far into the spring as possible. So in this case, we mowed that treatment 1 infield area in April 2024 and in 2025. Again, we weren't working in the zone 2 area or the shoulder area. We were only working in that infield area. So we excluded the first 30 feet from the edge of pavement for these mowing treatments. Next, we looked at adjusting ODOT's current schedule to be more of a late summer, early fall mow. So these were mowed sometime kind of when conditions permitted between late August and early September. These areas got mowed twice during the project, and again was only looking at that sort of zone 3 middle of the infield areas. Treatment 3 sort of represented an experimental control for us. This is basically continuing to mow these interchanges assigned to treatment 3 under current ODOT mowing SOPs. So these got mowed in December of 2024. We only had sort of 1 month of December in our stormwater monitoring window. So that's sort of why these only got mowed once. But again, this is just sort of representing business as usual, continuing the cadence and the timing at which ODOT was already mowing these areas throughout the 2-year stormwater monitoring phase of the study. And then the fourth infield area for this interchange here, we wanted to see what conditions would be like and sort of what nutrient export rates would be like if we backed off the frequency of backslope mowing on ODOT rights of way. So in this case, treatment 4 was do not mow, but in reality, the recommended treatment here was what happens if instead of mowing annually, we mow these every other year. So that was sort of the layout of the treatment design. We ended up selecting 2 clusters of infield areas, so 2 interchanges. The first one was in Ada, Ohio. This is at the intersection of Route 30, and I believe the north-south road here is State Route 235 or US 235. I'd have to go back and look, but we're operating around Ada, Ohio. And you can see the red dots there indicate where our monitoring equipment was placed. So we're sort of operating in the thaw leg of the ditches. And here we've delineated the drainage areas that feed runoff to those different points. So you can see that we get a pretty good representation of the entire infield area that's draining to our monitoring point. I will say that the entire infield area was mowed in accordance with the treatment that it was assigned. But generally speaking, we're getting the better part of half, if not more, of these infield areas draining to our monitoring locations, which, as you can see, end up being multiple acres for these sites in Ada, Ohio. So that was sort of our first cluster of sites. Our second cluster of sites, as I mentioned before, was in Signet, Ohio. The north-south road in the figure here is I-75, and the east-west road is an overpass of Signet Road. And you can see here again, we've got slightly varied catchment areas draining to our monitoring points, but each of those again is located in the thaw leg of the ditch where we're concentrating flow. And then we've got different size catchment areas ranging from just under an acre to almost 4¼ acres draining to those locations. So I'll briefly talk a little bit about the stormwater monitoring setup at each of these sites. As I mentioned a couple times now, we were operating in the thalweg of the ditches. And we used sort of the setup here that you can see in the figure on the right to concentrate flows into a point at which our monitoring equipment could measure flow rates and collect water quality samples. So Ben Phillips, Ryan Winston, and I, over the course of, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, went out and instrumented all of the facilities. So that included installing these 1 foot tall fiberglass H flumes, which we use to both measure runoff flow rates and collect water quality samples. And then on the upstream end of those on the upstream end of those fiberglass flumes, we installed some plywood wing walls. And again, being installed in the thalweg here, this allowed us an opportunity to kind of concentrate flows into a single point where we could measure them, measure flow rates using automated monitoring equipment, and collect samples using automated sampling equipment, both of which are housed in that brown metal jaw box on the upper left-hand part of the figure there. So 7 of our 8 sites looked just like this. The final one, which was treatment 4 at Signet, we had a slightly different setup there. Basically, instead of being drained by a ditch, the ditch kind of terminated in a culvert, a pipe. So we had in-pipe monitoring equipment at Signet 4. And then throughout the project, all samples that we collected were sent to the NEORSD lab for analysis of nutrients. So that would be, again, different nitrogen and phosphorus species, as well as total suspended solids. I want to just mention one thing about Signet 4 for a second. It wouldn't be a field monitoring study if there wasn't some sort of challenge that was had to be overcome midway through the project. And that for the research team happened at Signet 4. So after the first year of monitoring, we sort of determined that the in-pipe setup that we had just wasn't giving us very reliable data. And fortunately for us, as luck would have it, we actually had a second monitoring point that we were able to instrument for the second year of the study in 2025, which is just basically located at the end of the pipe leading away from Signet Treatment 4. Here you can sort of see in the image, we've got flow coming kind of from the top to the bottom following this dashed blue line and then making a 90-degree turn. And that 90-degree turn, we were able to install a V-notch weir and add basically a second monitoring equipment setup at that weir. And that allowed us to basically create a rating curve in 2025 to retroactively correct some of the erroneous measurements that we got in 2024. So, moral of the story here was we ended up being able to use both years of data, even though sometimes the equipment that we rely upon can be a little unreliable. Maybe a little bit more often than we'd like to admit. But fortunately for us, again, we were able to sort of instrument the second location and use that to get a full 2-year picture of the hydrologic and water quality picture at Signet Treatment 4. I'll next pass it to Cheryl. Let's talk about the aerial surveys.
Thank you, Andrew. I guess before I get into the aerial surveys, I will mention real briefly the reason why we chose interchanges to do the studies is because we were able to get the biggest area without driving for miles and having this test go on for miles on the side of the road, and even more importantly, without having a lot of influence from the neighbors, from variation in neighbors. So if one neighboring property was a farm and another was a forest and another was a housing development, your amount of runoff could vary and the nutrients could vary that's coming from those properties. So these interchanges were chosen so that they could be near each other and also that we could have the least amount of influence from the neighboring properties. So the water catchments are pretty well contained within those interchanges. So yeah, going on to the aerial surveys, we were able to have ODOT's drone staff assist us by going out with us 3 different times during the project. And they were able to collect RGB, orthomosaic imagery, and LiDAR data. And these were used to develop digital elevation models And those were used to estimate the catchment areas for each of the stormwater monitoring devices. So that way we would know the actual size from those flights. Previously, we were using mapping that was already created. So this gave a little bit more exact measurements there. You can go ahead and switch slides, thanks. So the what we knew was that nutrient cycling and the source sink dynamics between plants and soil. So as plants grow in the spring, they're going to take up nutrients from the soil. As they die in the fall, if they senesce, or if they get cut, those nutrients will either go back into the soil as the biomass degrades, or if heavy rains come through before the soil can uptake those nutrients, it can flush into runoff. And so we knew that nutrient cycling and the source sink dynamics between plants and soil can influence the overall nutrient balance of the site. In our literature review, we were seeing that previous studies, the mowing frequency was shown to influence the phosphorus uptake by the plants. So we wanted to see how the different timing windows for mowing might affect whether that nutrients were runoff or whether they would be taken up by plants and not as part of that stormwater runoff. So the influence of mowing on plant nutrient uptake and soil nutrient infiltration process is a principal mechanism by which mowing regimen could influence nutrient loading and runoff. In our study, we collected a total of 264 vegetation samples and 96 soil samples over the course of the study. And in order to do that, we broke up the treatment areas into what Ben was calling zip codes or little zones. And so they're all the same size, and we use those to select the areas where we would do the vegetation and the soil samples. And those samples were sent off to STAR Labs, and they were analyzed for nutrient content. And then we compared those nutrients that were in the soil samples and the vegetation samples across the mowing regimens and the seasons. So that's a photo of the drying oven. For the vegetation, we were looking at the cover that was out there, whether the sites had full cover or if there was any bare ground areas, and then the types of vegetation out there. Because the different types of vegetation can impact the nutrient dynamics to different amounts, and the differences in nutrient uptake rates, as well as the effects in the soil infiltration. So we conducted ground surveys of the vegetation in August of 25, and we visually estimated the coverage in the different parts of the treatment. So we looked at both the ditch, the foreslopes, and the interior areas, and we compare those across the mowing treatments. And let's see, so we looked at as I mentioned, the different types of vegetation. We were primarily looking at the grasses, the invasive species, and the native species out there to see if there could also be a difference by vegetation type. So the National Agricultural Imagery Program, otherwise known as NAEP data, that was gathered as a supplement to our ground surveys. And this data is readily available online. And we used this data to compare with what was going on out there on the ground. And the satellite imagery provides NDVI, which is a metric that utilizes differences in infrared and visible light reflectance to determine vegetation health and cover. Now, Davey, we are often using it in forested areas, but we were looking to apply it to these herbaceous areas as well. And values closer to a -1 appear as more that bright orange color, and they're usually more bare ground or have more open areas. 0 has moderate vegetation cover, and values closer to the 1 represent dense, healthy vegetation cover. So later on, we'll take a look at the results of what we found on site. I will go ahead and pass it back to Andrew now.
Okay, thanks very much, Cheryl. Excellent point about why we chose interchanges. Another thing that I sort of wanted to mention was that by co-locating our monitoring sites, we were able to do our best to control for one critical factor that could influence our results, which is related to sort of what kind of climate our different monitoring locations are exposed to, and what kind of rainfall patterns and that sort of thing. So the first sort of aspect of the results that I want to talk about relates to the precipitation record that we collected at both Ada and Cygnet. Over the course of the 2 monitoring seasons, we collected 78. We collected data from 78 rain events at Ada, excuse me, and 79 at Cygnet. And we sort of put some statistical power into those numbers to sort of determine whether we could be confident that the rainfall regime at both Ada and Cygnet was the same. And I won't get into the ins and outs of those methodologies today, but fortunately for us, we didn't see any differences in rainfall characteristics between the study locations. So in other words, the weather that the sites experienced at Cygnet was statistically the same as what was experienced at Ada, and therefore we can directly compare treatment 1 at Ada versus treatment 1 at Cygnet, or treatment 2 versus treatment 2, etc. We did see some seasonal trends in the rainfall records that were clearly apparent. You can sort of see this here, where we've got a box plot of average rainfall intensity for each storm event. Those little lowercase letters on each box plot, which correspond to spring, summer, or fall. When those letters are different, that indicates a significant difference from a statistical standpoint between box plots with different numbers, essentially. So here you can see that spring and fall both have a little lowercase a, but we see a little lowercase b above summer, where we see significantly higher average intensities, which is something that we expected, given the prevalence of convective thunderstorms that happen in the summertime here in Ohio. One other thing that we had to contend with was the historic drought that happened in fall 2024. I forget the exact number of weeks that went by without a measurable rain event, but that certainly impacted our results, both in terms of the amount of runoff that we could measure, but also the amount of runoff that we could sample for water quality analysis. Next, we'll move on to the way that we analyzed and interpreted the hydrologic results, which was related to a metric called runoff coefficient. So this is the ratio of runoff depth and rainfall depth. In other words, you can think of it as what was the fraction of rainfall that became surface runoff at a given site. And here we've got box plots for each of our different infield areas, so 8 in total, Ada being above Cygnet there. And what you can see just at a very high level is that all of these box plots are crammed down to a runoff coefficient of 0. So we have heavily zero-weighted data that we're working with in our data set here, meaning that more than half of all rain events that we measured at these sites oftentimes resulted in 0 surface runoff. We do see some slight statistically significant differences, but the one thing that we noted was that the sort of trends changed from Ada to Cygnet, so we didn't see a lot of consistencies in terms of trends that we could tie back to a strategic mowing regime. Another piece is that we saw the highest runoff coefficient, in other words, the greatest proportion of rainfall that became surface runoff, in infield areas that had what we refer to as wetland features. So you can see sort of a picture from the inlet of the pipe at Signet Treatment 4 there in the lower right-hand portion of the screen. We've got standing water, we've got wetland vegetation, and hydric soils. So kind of lump all of these things together, we ended up seeing a greater proportion of rainfall become surface runoff from types of sites that had these features than sites that were maybe more of a typical turf grass dominated, no saturated soils and that sort of thing. The last key takeaway that I want to point out here, again, is that because we didn't see these consistent trends across the mowing treatments, what we ended up hypothesizing is that a lot of these differences that we saw were more tied to how the watersheds themselves were different, instead of the strategic mowing regimen that we applied. So whether that was differences in the portion of watershed impervious cover or those wetland features, we tend to think that the watershed characteristics themselves were the primary driver of the hydrologic differences that we saw, and less so the mowing treatment that we applied. So this plot is looking at sort of all sites lumped together. Just like the way that runoff changed throughout the year, we also saw changes in the runoff coefficient throughout the year. Overall, the portion of rainfall which became surface runoff decreased, albeit very slightly, from spring to summer to fall. And this is likely due to changes in soil moisture or even perhaps a seasonally high groundwater table. And while it was an expected trend, it's sort of good to see that in our results here, where we're seeing more sort of surface runoff potential in the spring, and less so as soil moisture levels recede into the summer and fall, when we're starting to get more and more droughty conditions here in Ohio. The other way that we interpreted the hydrologic results was through a metric called runoff threshold. You can think of this as the runoff, as the rainfall depth, which causes runoff to occur. So we have a sort of plot like this that we made for each of our sites, where we're plotting rainfall depth on the x-axis and then runoff depth on the y-axis. And we're basically calculating the x-intercept of this trend line. When we lump all of our sites together, you can see here the various runoff thresholds there on the right-hand column. And what I just want to note here is that these are pretty high values. Given that this is impacted lands and we've had construction and heavy kind of maintenance at these sites, we still needed at times over 1/4 of an inch of rain to happen before we even saw runoff from the sites. So certainly an interesting finding for us here. And while we did see some differences, sort of like runoff coefficient, a lot of these were sort of tied to differences in the watershed composition and less so the differences in the strategic mowing treatment that we applied. Next, we'll talk a little bit about water quality. So as I mentioned before, we needed these relatively large rain events to actually collect water quality samples, and that really hampered the amount of data that we were able to collect over a 2-year period. So overall, we were able to collect between 6 and 19 water quality samples at each monitoring device or at each infield area. And big picture is that we saw little variation between the mowing treatments, and perhaps more importantly, the concentrations that we saw were surprisingly low. You can see orthophosphate and total phosphorus concentrations here. Again, this is for road runoff with no sort of upstream BMPs. And in aggregate, these concentrations were more similar to a vegetated filter strip than they were to road runoff. I'll sort of show some studies on the next one here, but we're fortunate to have as a resource the International Stormwater Best Management Practice Database. So that's put on by Clary et al., where they're able to aggregate a number of different studies that you can quickly pull data from, and sort of looking at the effluent concentrations for a vegetated filter strip, which is a engineered BMP for road runoff. We're seeing very similar levels of pollutants in the runoff that we measured from these various interchanges for this study here without any sort of upstream treatment, as I mentioned. So here are a subset of all the studies that we looked at. I just want to sort of highlight these bottom 3 rows here. So we've got sort of the average event mean concentration for various nutrients and total suspended solids for highway runoff in that top highlighted row there. The average for grassed swales from the International Stormwater BMP database in the middle, and then what we saw in our study in the bottom. And you can see sort of across the board that oftentimes the concentrations that we measured were half the value from highway runoff, or half the value from grass swales, or even lower in the case of TSS, really, as it compared to typical road runoff studies. So the water quality that we observed was quite clean relative to the literature, and I think speaks to Cheryl's point earlier about our ability to sort of isolate these areas so that we know kind of exactly what's coming in, i.e. The runoff from the roads themselves. We also looked at pollutant loads over time. The idea here was, do we see some sort of plug of nutrients, of runoff carrying any sort of leached nutrients shortly after a mowing event? And you can see here we've got rainfall records plotted for the 2-year study on the top plot, and then these vertical black lines represent the different mowing events. And then we've got different points on the bottom, which are color-coded by runoff coefficient and relate to, in this case, total phosphorus loading rates. And I just want to sort of add as a reminder, here we're calculating pollutant loads as the product of event mean concentration by runoff volume measured. And what we see here is, while there are some variations in total phosphorus loading rates, the increases or the decreases that we see in those loading rates appear to be much more closely tied with runoff coefficient than they do with timing of mowing. So you can sort of see that in like the highest total phosphorus loading rate. We've got a runoff coefficient, approaching 0.5. That happens before a mowing event. Shortly after the mowing event, we're kind of back into that typical range of quite a bit less than 0.01 pounds per acre. So again, pointing here to the fact that these watershed characteristics appear to be a primary driver of pollutant loads, and far less so the impact of the actual mowing events themselves. Last thing I want to highlight in terms of the water quality results is the estimates that we put together for annual pollutant loading rates. As a bit of a background, the baseline pollutant loading rates for total phosphorus that were used to develop the MOMI TMDL for developed lands ranged between 0.1 and 0.6 pounds per acre per year. If you're interested in how that's calculated, I've got probably too complicated an equation on this slide here, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that if there are any. And what I want to highlight is all of the treatments, with the exception of one, fell in the lower half of this range. The one exclusion here was Signet Treatment 4, where we only had six samples that we collected during the study. And so we have not maybe as clear of a picture of the water quality from that site as we do with the others. So really, we're sort of seeing that these different interchange areas, regardless of strategic mowing treatment that was applied, fall in the lower half of the total phosphorus TMDL calculation for the watershed, perhaps suggesting that ODOT rights-of-way do not disproportionately contribute to nutrient conveyance as it relates to the occurrence of harmful algal blooms. I'll pass it back to Cheryl to talk a little bit about the vegetation and soils results.
Thanks, Andrew. So as I was mentioning earlier, it's known that vegetation can impact the nutrient cycling with the soils. But we were unable to identify any trends in that cycle in relation to the timing of the mows. So the timing of the mows, we didn't see a relationship with the phosphorus uptake. And so the differences in the runoff nutrient concentrations couldn't be identified to differences in vegetation response to those mowing treatments. And so that lack of support for an effective mowing regimen on vegetation phosphorus content was attributed to the complexity of the nutrient cycling process in plants and soils, which can be influenced by a number of factors, including the plant species, the type, the age, and the environmental conditions captured by our sampling across the entire infield. So as I mentioned, we did have a variety of different vegetation between the cool season turf grasses. We had native grasses a little bit. We had invasives like Phragmites in some of those areas. And then we had measured the vegetation in the ditches as well as the infield areas and the pore slopes. So there was some variation in those areas. Go ahead and go, yeah, thank you. So moving on to the soil. So we had some similar findings with the soil phosphorus content couldn't be tied to the mowing regimen either. So that diversity of landscape features, where we were taking our samples, vegetation types, the timing of the sampling in each infield area captured the heterogeneity that made differences between treatments difficult to detect. So any variations we did capture couldn't be tied to just one variable. So regardless, the soil phosphorus content ranged from low to optimum, as Andrea had pointed out, like similarly in that the water samples that they had done, the phosphorus was low to optimum in the infield areas, and we're not super saturated, so the soils were unlikely to contribute to the increased nutrient runoff. You can move to the next one, thank you. So again, we looked at the different landscape features between the ditch, the slopes, and the interior areas, and we looked at the vegetation coverage in each, and probably the area with the most bare area was some of these ditches. And so here is one chart we have showing all of the sites, and it's just showing the ditches. But you could also see in here that, so the bare ground is represented by that brown, but in some areas there was a lot of invasives. If you get down into the Signet sites, a lot of invasives there, particularly Signet 4. And so sometimes maybe the placement of the monitoring devices relative to where those invasive Phragmites were could have had an impact on the findings of that runoff. All right, we'll move to the next slide. All right, so in this slide, you can see those catchment areas and the monitoring devices, and those colored patches represent the wetland vegetation. And so you could see where the wetland vegetation was heaviest throughout each of this, well, this one happens to be the Signet site. And Signet had more wetland vegetation in the ditch lines than Ada. So if you look at treatment 4, which I was talking about on the prior slide, you can see there's a lot more of that wetland vegetation out there. Although the water quality results were variable, the lower annual OPE loading and runoff volume at Signet 4 could be attributed to this wetland vegetation and the pooling of water near the sampling devices that was observed. The vegetation Signet treatment 4 could have impacted the water retention, vegetative nutrient uptake, and soil infiltration conditions within the ditch lines near the monitoring device, so resulting in the lower OP and runoff volume. Let's scoot on to the next one. Go ahead and change slides. Thank you. So we looked at the vegetation data in another way too. We wanted to see if that NDVI imagery that I mentioned earlier on showed any differences with these different treatments that we were doing out there on the 2 sites. So there was 2 sets of NDVI data available to us. One taken just prior to the start of our field research, and then one in the June of 2025. And when we looked at the data, it was similar across the infield areas for both interchanges. So it didn't display an effective mowing treatment on the vegetation health and coverage that could be tied to the nutrient loading. So earlier I had mentioned the closer to 1, the better the health of the vegetation, and closer to 0 is more neutral. Below 0 would be more like a bare ground situation. So there's not a lot of variation as you look at the mean and DVI values here. They're all pretty similar between each of the sites. I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Andrew.
All right, thanks, Cheryl. So just want to quickly wrap up so we've got some time for questions here. So overall, over the course of this two and a half year project and 2 years of stormwater, soil, and vegetation monitoring, we ended up finding no measurable changes to nutrient export rates or differences in runoff hydrology that we could really link specifically to the different strategic mowing efforts that we tested. Instead, we hypothesize and sort of have come to the conclusion that watershed characteristics are really the ultimate reason why we saw some of those differences. So whether it was variations in watershed size or the portion of those watersheds that were impervious, as Cheryl just mentioned, a lot of the differences in vegetation coverage or soil composition, or even those wetland features that we saw, especially at Signet, where we just saw those highlighted areas in the Thalweg, sort of on the south end of Signet Treatment 4. The abundance, the collection of these factors overshadowed, we think, any effects of the different mowing treatments that we tested. However, what we ended up concluding as well, though, was that the annual pollutant loading rates that we estimated suggest that these highway rights-of-ways aren't necessarily a disproportionate contributor to harmful algal blooms in both the Maumee and western Lake Erie watersheds. So ultimately, our recommendations for implementation, while it was fun to test these different strategic mowing treatments, our ultimate recommendation is not to change current mowing operations, which already account for several environmental factors that are being addressed. So things like minimizing the spread of invasives and working around the migratory windows for pollinator species such as the monarch butterfly. However, the research team also did recommend ODOT to consider allowing wetland features to develop when the road safety and sort of topography conditions permit. So we did attribute these wetland features to reduced phosphorus loads in the stormwater that we measured across the study. So that might be one way to sort of introduce these different facets that overshadowed the mowing into the watersheds to improve phosphorus management. And then finally, because how prevalent the influence of impervious cover was in our results, we also recommend ODOT to consider the implementation of other roadside BMPs to address specifically the effects of impervious cover. There's many folks to thank, several which probably are not on this slide. From Davie Resource Group, we definitely want to give a special shout out to Shelby Loy and the Davie mowing crews who performed all of the mowing for the infield areas for this project. They were really good working with us across the various stormwater monitoring years to get the mowing done in these sometimes very tight windows when weather conditions permitted. A number of undergraduate research assistants from Ohio State University to thank. Their names are listed here. A lot of this effort involved some very physical labor, including weed trimming and collecting sometimes teasel species that were taller than our undergraduate researchers. So we want to thank their efforts, which, as I mentioned, were pretty physical in nature throughout the project. From ODOT, want to thank the folks up in Districts 1 and 2 and the Ohio, that should say UAS Center, the uncrewed aircraft systems who performed the drone flights for us. And then last but not least, members of the TAC and the ODOT Research Office for sort of helping us along the way and collaborating with us on this project. I did want to note that the final report will be available in June 2026 as we wrap up some final edits here, and we are happy to provide a PDF version of these slides from today's webinar as well once we get into June. And with that, I'd like to spend the last few minutes that we have answering any questions from the audience. Thanks very much for your attention and attendance today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew and Cheryl. Okay, so first question. What is the defined difference from edge of pavement for transition zone versus the undisturbed zone, specifically as it relates to backslope mowing? The information provided suggests that there is no undisturbed zone with the entire back slope being mown annually?
Okay, so if I understood the question correctly, the sort of transition that we go from zone 2 to zone 3 typically happens around 30 feet from the edge of the pavement when conditions permit. What delineates zone 3 and 4 is maybe a little less well defined and maybe a little more site specific. Cheryl, if you have any other insights with that one, I think the sites that we worked in here primarily had only zone 3 in the middle, for example.
Yeah, you're doing great there. I think ODOT's typically would be mowing this entire site in the wintertime. So that would fall into their mowback is what they typically call it. And so whether you want to call this zone 3 or 4 in the center of those interchanges, we were just following their practices and then altering them for our different windows to see if that had an effect on the vegetation out there. And as you can see, there were some trees out there as well. Obviously, we let them be as they were, but ODOT's objective here would be not to, they don't often allow a lot of trees, want a lot of trees coming up in these interchanges to allow line of sight for motorists going around.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, next question. What is the perceived percentage of nutrient loading resulting from ODOT right-of-way vegetation management relative to all other lands within the watershed?
That is a great question. I would probably want to dig in a little bit more to the TMDL documentation there, but I think as we've shown with our results, the data suggests that ODOT, in terms of its role compared to other land managers in the MAMI, aren't disproportionately contributing anyway to nutrient export because of right-of-way maintenance. In terms of how it compares as a portion, I think that you might be able to find that information in the different waste load allocations in the TMDL. I just don't have that number right in front of me offhand.
From what I recall, ODOT's range was much lower than others out there. But yeah, I don't remember the exact numbers.
Great, thank you. And last question. For further studying the watersheds, would there be any benefit to study the presence or lack thereof of invertebrates in addition to vegetative cover?
Cheryl, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? What about invertebrates? How does it relate?
Absolutely. They're saying for further studying the watersheds, would there be any benefit to study the presence or lack thereof invertebrates in addition to vegetative cover?
I don't think so for showing the runoff and the loading in it. If you were looking at vertebrates, you could look at the health of the areas out there, the health of the habitat, whether that is upland or wetland type of habitat. But I'm not sure that would have could have any impact on the results of the loading that would come off of it.
Yeah, I think I'd maybe just would add in hearing Cheryl's comments that the invertebrates might be something to consider in a receiving stream. And that might be an indicator of how nutrient management along upstream portions of that watershed, which could include these right-of-ways, impacts stream health. But yeah, agreed with Cheryl. I don't think that the presence of invertebrates would necessarily help us determine runoff or water quality mitigations.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, and we had one more question. Just slide in and then we'll wrap it up. Question is, do you have research plans for looking into urban watersheds and roadside drainage swales along county roadways? These are collecting runoff from a variety of land uses, many of which use fertilizers and chemicals in lawn care.
That's a great question. No plans as of this point in time, but I think your point is very well made that, we've highlighted here just a very small subset of different types of right-of-ways across the MAMI, which could include those urban areas, but maybe most especially those areas that get a lot of off-site runoff to them. I think that there could be some potential to explore the impacts of different mowing there, but also probably just given how high some of those concentrations are, especially in ag watersheds, maybe looking at different types of BMPs or something like that, or other types of approaches, I should say, to address those nutrients is something that I'd love to explore in future research, but when the time comes, for sure.
Good answer. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. On behalf of LTAP and ODOT, I'd like to thank Andrew and Cheryl once again for sharing their valuable knowledge and expertise with us. Just a couple of final reminders as we sign off. Keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be sending out the link to the session recording to all registered attendees within the next week. If you are logged in and present for the full duration of the webinar, you will receive a certificate of attendance within 5 business days. As we close out, a super short survey of 4 questions will pop up in your browser. If you have 60 seconds, please let us know your thoughts. It really helps us fine tune these programs for you. Thank you all so much for being with us today. We hope you're walking away with some great insights for your work. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next one.